About 3 years ago, Donald Trump pulled the U.S. out of the JCPOA, or Iran nuclear deal. He subsequently imposed escalating punitive sanctions on Iran. Even the coronavirus pandemic didn't change this. In response, Iran progressively stepped out of its JCPOA constraints on uranium enrichment and other nuclear activities. But Trump's successor is talking of stepping back into the deal, beginning with 3 gestures. So perhaps Iran will reverse its withdrawal. I say perhaps because talks alone just aren't going to cut it for Iran anymore. Iran has said not enough. The U.S. must verifiably end the whole economic terrorism of Trump-era sanctions, or else it will have failed to exercise due diligence in practicing its international obligations. The leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Seyyed Ali Khamenei, has urged that the U.S. and the EU troika violated all of their JCPOA commitments and therefore don't get to set conditions for Iran. You're watching Iran Today. Stay tuned for the latest developments in Iran's nuclear program and Western reactions. U.S. President Joe Biden has installed a new team of diplomats with the task of undoing and repairing the damage done during the Trump era. U.S. violation of the JCPOA is but one of those damages. But the Biden team has been demanding Iran's full compliance to the JCPOA as a precondition to renegotiating that deal, lifting U.S. sanctions on Iranian individuals, removing U.S. objection to an IMF loan to Iran, and facilitating humanitarian trade with this country. There is one thing pressing the Biden administration to make an urgent move. That is a recent law passed by Iranian parliament. The Strategic Act of the Islamic Consultative Assembly to remove sanctions. The act obligates Iran's government to block snap inspections by the UN nuclear watchdog from February 22nd if its partners to the JCPOA did not implement their own commitments under the deal. The aim is to restore balance in parties' commitment to the deal by getting sanctions lifted off Iran. This would ultimately save the deal, which was originally meant to limit Iran's peaceful nuclear program in return for sanctions relief. A letter was sent to the UN nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, by Iran's permanent representative to that Vienna-based organization, Kazem Gharibabadi. In it, he clarified the reasons for the December law. Our guest highlights the important points. Mr. Behishtipur always has a studied, honest viewpoint to put in. Once a news manager at Press TV, he joined us on Skype.
When Iran saw that it can't trust the American side, it moved towards the implementation of the law enacted by the Iranian parliament. The responsibility for reaching this point rests with the United States, because it can easily return to the JCPOA. If it returns, Iran will also go back to the JCPOA.
Mr. Shariat Madari is the editor-in-chief of Kayhan Daily, a renowned face on the Iranian political spectrum. Let's hear him out.
The
point about the additional protocol is snap visits from any place at any time. That is, they took away all our intelligence. We should not have accepted it at all from the beginning. The inspections have been so rigorous that after the JCPOA was reached, Obama himself said the inspections that were put in place for Iran are a system that is unprecedented in the history of the IAEA. We need to stop our voluntary implementation of the additional protocol. First, it is legal to withdraw, because it was voluntary, and second, it had to be approved by the parliament, which it wasn't, and third, they took all our intelligence. So this is a very important thing that is unfortunately being done with a delay.
Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has among many voices urged President Biden to return to the JCPOA and lift all of Trump's sanctions. He said, surrendering to law is not a fault. Do not shy away. What is bad is surrendering to force. Also, in a telephone conversation with German Chancellor Angela Merkel, he said of the nuclear deal, "It is a document approved by the Security Council and the product of the long efforts of Iran and the 6 largest countries in the world. The JCPOA has a specific framework and is unchangeable." It is impossible to enter new topics into the JCPOA. This Rouhani stressed in light of the fact that even Europeans have been trying to rewrite the deal to get Iran to namely scrap its basic defenses, its ballistic missile program. Mr. Sadatian is a political expert who served as ambassador to the UK. His insight is that of one who's seen the other side up front.
Now
they're making demands beyond what we agreed on, that we do not necessarily discuss at this point. They demand to discuss Iran's missile range and Iran's regional influence. There's a lot to talk about. You have to first prove your goodwill and then come back for talks. But the fact is that Iran has a natural influence in the region. How can they ask us to reduce our influence? We need to stick to the facts on the ground. The Islamic Republic has reached such a point of reliance and strength that it's not afraid of negotiations.
Mr. Ajarlu is editor-in-chief of Mosalla's magazine. Let's hear a word from the editor.
We negotiated and implemented the JCPOA once, and there is no reason to return to it again with preconditions. In our view, the JCPOA is a multilateral agreement in which we fulfilled our obligations but did not benefit as much. What the Parliament has done is a clear signal that we're ready to go back to the pre-JCPOA era and even reconsider inspections, and that we can leave aside dealing with the IAEA with goodwill.
So far, the US and Iran have been stuck in a negotiating stalemate. According to some diplomats, disputes about who must make the first step are absolutely counterproductive, and instead, the process needs to be carefully synchronized.
It seems that this step-by-step mechanism, meaning that they take its steps and Iran acts accordingly, and takes measures in 5 gradual steps. In addition to, implementing the Parliament's passed law is sufficient and sometimes can be given. It might not be necessary to refuse to allow in the inspectors under these circumstances.
The United States is not in a position to set conditions. It has violated and broken its promise. First, all sanctions must be lifted, not on paper, but in action. Therefore, we must verify it. So, some gentlemen are wrong when they say that we will return immediately after the Western side returns. It is not so. Sanctions must be lifted and we must verify them. For example, we have to be able to do our business, import or export. When we exported our products, the money has to return to the country. Well, this takes time. We have to make sure that the sanctions on the banks are lifted.
To look at Biden's 3-step plan to resolve the dispute over the nuclear deal, the U.S. said it would accept the EU High Representative's invitation for discussions with Iran and the 5 other signatories of the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. At the same time, Biden rescinded Trump's claim to have reimposed all UN sanctions on Iran via JCPOA snapback mechanism. Other signatories and the UN Security Council at large had denied the Trump move had any validity anyway, as the U.S. was no longer a party to the deal. The U.S. has also dropped special restrictions on Iranian diplomats in New York imposed by the Trump administration, which limited them to the Iranian mission, the ambassador's residence, the airport, and a 6-block radius around the UN. They will now be subject to the limits that were in force before the Trump era, a 25-mile radius around Midtown Manhattan.
Now it's our turn. They have played their cards and have no trump card to play. That's why they resort to such excuses. The UN Security Council rejected the snapback of sanctions, with an overwhelming majority of 13 member states voting against it. They want to sell this to us as a privilege. They say they have brought in a woman of Iranian descent to the State Department. This indicates that their hands are now empty.
Both countries have signaled their readiness to revive the agreement since Joe Biden's inauguration, but have differed on who should make the first move.
I think we should wait for their practical action, not that we should take the practical action. Our practical action was a parliament's law, which I think we should continue to implement. We have to speak the language of the world, and we're doing just that. If we talk to them gently, their demands will become more outrageous.
Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has previously signaled a conditional openness to talks with Washington and the other parties over reviving the deal. And he appreciated Biden for acknowledging that Trump's UN sanctions claim had no legal validity, but he demanded U.S. unconditionally and effectively lift all sanctions imposed, pre-imposed, or relabeled by Trump. We will then immediately reverse all remedial measures. Our remedial measures, expansion of Iran's nuclear activity in recent years, are a response to U.S. E3 violations. Remove the cause if you fear the effect. We'll follow action with action. There's plenty more to our narrative, but first, let's give other media outlets a chance to have their say.
Welcome. In today's news section, we will take a look at some of the most interesting topics related to Iran's new approach to the JCPOA and the dispute between Iran and the US. Mehr News Agency takes a look at China's proposal for the future of the JCPOA. The headline reads, "All parties should push for unconditional US return to JCPOA." In reaction to the recent remarks by US officials about returning to the JCPOA, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said that all parties should push for the unconditional return of the US to the JCPOA as soon as possible. Currently, the Iranian nuclear issue is at a critical stage, with both opportunities and challenges. China holds that the return of the United States to the JCPOA is the only correct approach to resolve the impasse on this issue, said Hua Chunying. All parties should act with greater urgency, work together to implement the consensus reached at the foreign ministers' meeting last December, and push for the unconditional return of the United States to the JCPOA as soon as possible, and the lifting of all sanctions on Iran, she added. Urdu Point News takes a look at Iran's foreign ministry's reaction to the US's latest gestures for easing of tensions. Here's the headline. Iran studies EU proposal to hold meeting of JCPOA members with US, according to Iran's foreign ministry. Tehran is considering the proposal of the European Union to hold an informal meeting between the members of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, together with the United States. Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said on February the 21st. "We are studying the proposal, communicate with friends, Russia and China, on the issue. Following consultations, we will make a decision," Araghchi said during an appearance on TV. The Deputy Foreign Minister added that there was a chance to revive the nuclear deal after US President Joe Biden's arrival to the White House. The Russian Sputnik News informs its readers of Iran's stance regarding US's recent movements. Its headline reads as follows: US return to JCPOA pointless if sanctions are not lifted in action, Iran's envoy to UN says. While the United States has recently signaled it could return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, no actual steps have been taken by Washington. The United States' possible return to the Iran deal will be meaningless if Washington doesn't lift all sanctions it imposed against Tehran first, Iranian ambassador to the United Nations Majid Takhtravanchi said in an interview with Khamenei.ir. According to Takhtravanchi, Washington introduced 3 types of sanctions against the nation, and, quote, if even one of them is not lifted, the U.S. return, quote, to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, which former President Donald Trump left in 2018, would be pointless. Well, that's it for the news section. Stay tuned for our show's main narrative.
How did European signatories to the deal support Iran after Trump's violation of the accord? It is true, Europe has been trying to save the nuclear deal. It did vow to protect Iran's economy against the U.S. sanctions, but none of its initiatives have so far produced a satisfactory result. After the U.S. departure from the nuclear agreement, Europe undertook 11 commitments to safeguard Iran's JCPOA interests in areas such as oil sales, insurance, aviation, shipping, and industrial cooperation, but none have been fulfilled so far. The European signatories to the deal have failed to install a working mechanism that could bypass the U.S. banking stranglehold for repatriating Iran's oil revenues. Who could blame them for trembling at the thought of infringing U.S. sanctions? Trump was a bully.
Now, one can say that the US withdrew from the nuclear agreement. A madman like Trump left the deal, a move which the Americans did not approve of themselves. This doesn't necessarily mean that the Democrats, Mr. Biden and his team are committed to maintaining international standards and saving their face. Mr. Trump acted like a bully on many other issues. For example, he deactivated Obamacare. He built a wall along the southern border to prevent Mexican migrants from coming to the US. He even abolished the NAFTA Pact. He withdrew from so many international agreements. His madness didn't only affect the JCPOA.
Iran fulfilled all of its JCPOA commitments until the U.S. pullout. The IAEA verified this 15 times at least. Let's hear an expert say whether Western parties to the deal fulfilled any of theirs.
The Americans did not commit to what they signed. When we asked the Europeans why they didn't intervene, they said we are a group of private companies that are influenced by the United States. The government here is small and powerless. If the government does not have the power, why did they sign and guarantee the agreement? In my opinion, Europe is completely influenced by the US and can only play a decorative role in the negotiations, or in some cases, promote the US position.
If Iran's experience of the first chapter of the JCPOA is any indication of what might happen in the future, is it logical for Iran to participate in another round of negotiations? On the other hand, could the situation get any worse than it is right now for Iranians after the inhumane sanctions that the Trump administration imposed on them?
We created our own problems. For example, what does unbridled inflation has to do with sanctions? Or what about market liquidity that has escalated multifold? The fact that some people take liquidity to the housing market one day and to the dollar and gold coins market the other doesn't have anything to do with sanctions. We have to think for ourselves. How can they sanction a country with 15 neighbors? So the problem is that many of these problems can be solved if we believe in ourselves. But of course, sanctions also create problems.
Iran will resume honoring the nuclear deal in full only after the US has removed all sanctions on Tehran in a practical and verifiable manner. Because, as Ayatollah Khamenei has said, the domineering order has always looked for excuses against the Islamic Revolution. One day it's human rights, once vilifying theocracy, once the nuclear issue, and once regional issues. They're all excuses. The key concern is that Iran won't give in to their domination. Mere words don't help, this time only action. A new agreement is possible as far as Iran is concerned, provided it also respects Iran's right to nuclear technology for peaceful purposes.
Negotiation is a diplomatic tool and can never be left out. Negotiations are a tool that can be useful or harmful. If done appropriately, it is excellent and helps break deadlocks like the JCPOA, which was the first international undertaking after World War II to resolve a crisis through dialogue. In this way, negotiations are not good or bad in nature. It depends on what, how, and for what purpose we negotiate, and also who are the negotiating parties.
We can't change the subject. The problem isn't what to do to take the US back to the JCPOA. The problem is the lifting of the sanctions. It does not matter to us whether the United States returns or not. Let the Europeans figure that out. The United States has violated Security Council Resolution 2231. Why doesn't Europeans protest? The Security Council must act against it now and issue a resolution. Not only they didn't issue a resolution, they didn't even make a statement or an implicit warning. This is the environment we need to negotiate in.
Reflecting on government obligations with regard to the additional protocol of the NPT Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, Tehran's decision to suspend voluntary implementation of that protocol would not mean that Iran intends to expel the UN nuclear watchdog's inspectors. The additional protocol allows intrusive inspection of Iranian nuclear facilities, and that intrusion, which allowed in spies and sabotage, is deemed unacceptable. Anyhow, Iranian parliament adopted its December urgency law with its 22nd of February deadline for other parties' recommitment.
In fact, we failed to act during this time. According to paragraphs 26 and 36 of the JCPOA, which deal with the issues related to non-compliance, we had to retaliate immediately after they failed to meet their obligations. We had to stop fulfilling our obligations right away. But we did not do that. We waited so long that Trump left the JCPOA. Their excuse was that Iran's missile industry and Iran's presence in the region should be included in the JCPOA. Besides, they wanted to extend the restrictions indefinitely.
UN nuclear watchdog Head Rafael Grossi arrived late Saturday, February 20th in Iran for talks on the eve of Tehran's deadline for U.S. sanctions to be lifted. This was his second trip to Iran in the past year. Grossi said on Sunday, February 21st, that it has struck a deal with Iran to cushion the blow of steps Tehran plans to take this week that include ending snap inspections, with both sides agreeing to keep necessary monitoring for up to 3 months while Iran stops cooperation with the agency until sanctions are lifted. Meaning that Iran will record the activities of its nuclear sites via the installed CCTV cameras and will store them for up to 3 months. If any desirable development occurs, Iran will hand over the footages to the IAEA or else will erase them for good. In opposition to this agreement between the administration and the IAEA, the Iranian parliament passed a vote on referring the administration's deviation from the parliament's bill to the judiciary on February 22nd. On the evening of Monday, February 22nd, the same day of the parliament's move, in a meeting with the members of the Assembly of Experts, the leader of the Islamic Revolution stressed his concerns over escalation of such differences, which could be interpreted as divide in the country.
شنیدم امروز بین دولت و مجلس، یعنی بین اون کاری که دولت کرده و اون برداشتی که مجلس داره، یه اختلاف نظری وجود داره. این اختلاف نظر رو باید حل کرد. باید حل کنن، نبایستی این اختلافات اینجوری رو یا رها کنن به حال خود یا تشدید کنن و نشان دهنده دو صدایی باشن. نه، اینا قابل حل، باید حل بکنن. بالاخره دولت خودش رو موظف میدونه به اینکه قانون رو عمل کنه. قانون هم قانون خوبی است، باید هم به دقت عمل بشود. دو طرف در این زمینه همکاری کنن با هم که این عمل بشه.
The December law obligates the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, AEOI, to install advanced centrifuges, increase the level of nuclear enrichment to 20%, and halt the additional protocol if the illegal sanctions against Iran are not lifted. Iran insists all these steps are reversible if the parties to the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, honor their commitments. Iran will remain party to the NPT Safeguards Agreement, although the government is obliged to prevent foreign access and monitoring beyond the additional protocol. In the U.S., the think tanks Atlantic Council and Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft have published analysis which warned Biden to race against the clock to escape the so far dangerous game between Iran and the U.S. Robert E. Hunter, the 1990s U.S. ambassador to NATO, believes that Biden must be willing to take some political heat to break the current standoff between the two capitals. He points to the time as a constraint and recommends the simplest first step would be for Biden, by a stroke of his pen, to reverse President Donald Trump's May 2018 withdrawal from the JCPOA. That would challenge Iran to de-escalate. The expert realizes that U.S. domestic politics, Arab states of the Persian Gulf, and Israel are the main factors complicating Biden's decision-making towards the Iran nuclear deal. I asked for a practical solution to the impasse to relations between Iran and the West.
As long as we rely on independence, in its true sense, and on pure Islam, that is fighting oppression, and the West emphasizes its arrogant nature, both sides remain opposed to each other. This conflict will end when one of the parties gives up its identity. Either we become their servants, or the United States, as Imam Khomeini put it, stops acting so foolishly, stubbornly. As long as this is the case, there will be conflicts. We are by nature opposed to each other.
Mikhail Ulyanov, ambassador to the UN for Russia, one of Iran's two friends among JCPOA signatories, also welcomed the U.S.'s move to join talks. Now is the time for realpolitik and diplomacy, he said in a message to the U.S. The sooner you and your Iranian colleagues, as well as other JCPOA participants, start pragmatic discussions on the way out of the current unfortunate situation, the better. Yet another episode comes to an end, but the show goes on, as do nuclear deal discussions. So do return to the box at the same times next week and each week after. Thanks for watching.